Hello AP Psychology students, and welcome to our very last video for the treatment or for the health and physical and mental health unit. Today we are going to be continuing discussing treatment of psychological disorders, which is topic 5.5, and we are focusing on learning objective 5.5D, which is describe techniques used with psychological therapies and describe the effective uses of hypnosis. And in order to get at both of these objectives, we have two essential questions. So the first is, how do different theoretical orientations impact treatment techniques? And second is, what are some common applications of different therapies? So first is just kind of connecting what we've already learned throughout the whole course of AP Psychology to the idea of therapy. So for a long time, we've been talking about these perspectives, right? We've got psychodynamic, humanistic, cognitive, behavioral, biological, sociocultural, evolutionary, right? And the idea is that these different perspectives, when we look at them from a therapeutic lens, they're often referred to as theoretical orientations. So a theoretical orientation is just a perspective that a psychologist uses to guide their kind of framework for understanding the client, their behavior, and what interventions would be most useful. We're going to go over a couple different ones based on those main perspectives we learned about. You see some examples in this chart below. So first, I want to talk about humanistic therapy, not because it is a kind of like the oldest therapy, a type of therapy, but because I, in looking and researching and becoming and getting a master's degree in counseling, most of the groundwork of what it means to be a good therapist and to have a connection with your client is focused in this humanistic therapy. So even if you use techniques from other concepts, you still tend to have or utilize a lot of the techniques from humanistic. So this is known as person-centered therapy, and it's really focused on here and now. So while they're not against you talking about the past or things that have happened to your life, really the goal of the therapy is to focus on how you feel currently and how you can change or kind of grow in your current position. So they really think that individuals are unique, their experiences are unique, and that people can grow and become, their full best selves. So the goal of this therapy is for the client to develop a strong sense of self, find meaning, and live a more fulfilling life. And the picture here you have is of Carl Rogers. He is the kind of founder of the humanistic perspective and really influential in the therapy space in terms of the development of humanistic therapy techniques. So what are some common applications of humanistic therapy? So they found very effective for anxiety disorders of all kinds, depression, and then just, relationship and interpersonal issues that don't necessarily meet the criteria for a diagnosis, but are something that people, want help kind of dealing with and figuring out their way through. So what are some key techniques that these therapists use? So these will not be new ideas. These, again, align with a lot of the therapeutic alliance stuff we already mentioned. So active listening, making sure that you kind of reflect back what you're hearing to the client, unconditional positive regard, so accepting them, being genuine, and then a new one, which is called being non-directive. So the active listening, unconditional positive regard, empathy are kind of core to any therapy, although they are traditionally humanistic techniques. But the non-directive technique is very much humanistic in that it's not like the therapist does not control the session. It's the client who controls the session. They lead the session. They can lead their own healing. They have the power to influence their own change. It's really just you that's there kind of as like the guide on that journey with them. Next, we have psychodynamic therapy. The focus of this therapy is on the past, the unconscious experiences, and how they influence you. Very much influenced by Freudian principles that we learned about in the personality unit. And the goal of this is to uncover your repressed thoughts and emotions, and then ultimately try to, after you uncover them, to deal with them, right? And some common applications of this, it can be very effective in dealing with interpersonal problems. We see it used with depression, anxiety, and personality disorders. So two key techniques that the psychodynamic therapy uses is free association and dream interpretation. So free association is just a technique where the client is allowed to say whatever comes to mind. Sometimes they do this strategy where like the therapist will say one thing and then the client says the first thing that comes to mind. So if I say mom, you would say a word, and then I would take the word you said and say another word. And the idea is just to get the client kind of talking without censorship, so that you might get an idea of some of the different things that are kind of affecting their unconscious. The other key technique for psychodynamic therapy is dream interpretation. So analyzing dreams for their unconscious meaning, figuring out kind of the hidden meaning behind dreams, and trying to gain insight into the client through that method. Cognitive therapy is a focus on the thoughts, right? So remember, cognitive psychology, cognitive perspective is that thinking, right? So we're focusing on thought patterns and beliefs in cognitive therapy. The goal is to identify and change negative maladaptive thought and belief patterns, and some common applications. So again, very useful for depression, anxiety, helpful in eating disorders, and also they find that it is an effective therapy for substance abuse disorders. And remember, this doesn't necessarily mean it would be the only therapy. It might be used alongside medication or other techniques, but they have found results with these different psychological disorders. So what are some cognitive therapy techniques? So first, there's cognitive restructuring, which is literally exactly like it sounds, in that you have problems with the way that you think, and so the goal of your therapist is to restructure them. So help you to identify the problems and then change your thinking so that it is more productive, helpful, positive, etc. So you see a bunch of different cognitive distortions that clients might show up with, and then your goal would be to identify that and to help them change those distortions. Fear hierarchies, so particularly people who are dealing with anxiety or phobias of any kind, coming up with a hierarchy of things that are more less frightening to you to more frightening, as a way to kind of organize your thinking around the topic. And then discussing and working with the cognitive triad, specifically with depression. The cognitive triad is about negative views of the world, negative views of oneself, and negative views about the future, and how all three of those can lead to kind of the increasing worthlessness or helplessness that people feel when struggling with depression. Behavioral therapy is also called applied behavioral analysis. And this is a focus on maladaptive negative learning patterns, so behaviors, right? So cognitive is focusing on the thinking, behavioral is focused on the behaviors, right? The things that we can see, the actions people take. And the goal is to use these principles of classical and operant conditioning that we learned about a long time ago in the learning unit to modify negative behavior. So some common applications, we see this a lot being used with autism spectrum disorders or other developmental difficulties, different behavioral challenges that people struggle with, and phobias or social anxieties. Anything that you really see that a person's direct behavior can be influenced, you might use a behavioral therapy. So with behavioral therapies, we have techniques that are classically condition focused and techniques that are operant condition focused. So for classical conditioning, we've got both exposure therapy and aversive therapy. And for operant conditioning techniques, we've got token economies and biofeedback. So let's talk about each of those. So for exposure therapy, it literally is what it sounds. You expose your client to whatever they're afraid of, but it's not just like, they're afraid of water, so you toss them in the pool, right? There is a strategy, there's a system. And this therapy was originally designed, or originally kind of tested with a little boy who was afraid of rats. And so they had him eat one of his favorite snacks and then showed him a rat. And over time, they found that he was learning to have a positive association with the rat because of the positive snack that was connected with it, right? So basically classical conditioning, right? But instead of learning a fear, you unlearn a fear. So a very common use of this exposure therapy is with something called systematic desensitization, where they gradually expose somebody to whatever it is that they fear with that fear hierarchy. So the example I showed you of all the different things people are afraid of. So they engage you in something you're afraid of. They let your fear rise. They let your fear come down. They teach you relaxation techniques, and then they move on to the next thing that you're afraid of. And they can do this in real life, but you could also do this with virtual reality in order to kind of make smaller steps along the way if the person needs more in between, like a picture and a real life spider, for example. Another behavioral technique that's based in classical conditioning is aversion therapy. So this is, again, classical conditioning, but instead of pairing it with something pleasant, you pair something that people like that maybe they shouldn't like or have an addiction to with something unpleasant, right? So the example here I have is with alcohol, where the neutral stimulus would be alcohol. You connect it with a drug that produces nausea, and then eventually the goal would be that the thought of drinking alcohol creates a sick feeling. Okay, so in terms of operant conditioning techniques, remember we're talking about positive and negative reinforcement, positive negative punishment. So a really great example of this is token economy. It's basically where individuals earn tokens for doing behaviors that you're trying to teach them, and then they exchange them for rewards. This can be very useful for building skills with children who have developmental disability or developmental disorders, or if they autism spectrum disorders or other social anxieties. Here's an example of what a token economy might look like. So you have the behavior in the bottom, staying in a seat. You have the number of days that he's accomplished it, and then what he's working towards. And then finally, for behavioral therapy, we've got biofeedback therapy. So this is a therapy where you use technology. Basically, you hook yourself up to a computer, and then you can actually see all of your psychological or your physiological, body responses. So heart rate, blood pressure, breathing, all of these things. And you use it as a way to teach yourself through reinforcement, right, how to control different body responses, right? So you learn how to slow down your breathing, or how to change your heart rate, or how to whatever, and then when you do it, you can actually see it changing on the screen in front of you, and then that acts as positive reinforcement in order to help control the body response to some different psychological issues. So this works with anxiety, depression, and other physical symptoms. Okay, and then we have cognitive behavioral therapy. So this is a combination of cognitive and behavioral therapies. It combines them. And there's two specific types that you have to know. There's way more than two types, but the two types you have to know is dialectical behavior therapy, which I talked about in the previous video, and rational emotive behavior therapy. So this is called REBT for short, and it works kind of like this. So there's an event, you lose your job, there's a belief, I'm worthless, and then the emotional consequences, depression or sadness or worthlessness. The goal is to identify that belief and figure out how you can disrupt it, right? So change it in order to say okay, you're not worthless, people lose their jobs, this might not be the right fit for me, the right company, the right career, I have skills that are worthwhile, I have something to give back to the community, and then that gives you a different set of expected behaviors and a different set of consequences that is more productive. This is really great for obsessive compulsive disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, phobias, and for personality disorders. And last but not least, there is hypnosis. There is evidence-based applications for hypnosis when it comes to pain management and anxiety reduction. So we do know that hypnosis can work. However, we are very careful because hypnosis has not been found to be effective for things that we traditionally think of it used for, which would be memory retrieval or regressing to when you were younger. All right, so today we talked about different theoretical orientations and the techniques that they use. Make sure you can answer these essential questions. That's all for now, AP Psychos. And remember, psychology is flippin' awesome.